Before Stephen Colbert learned that mocking a legend has consequences, he thought Clint Eastwood would be an easy target for late-night comedy. This is the story of how one sentence from the 94-year-old icon turned Colbert's joke into his most humiliating moment on television. "Come on, cowboy, show us that famous squint." Stephen Colbert mocked 94-year-old Clint Eastwood in the CBS studio as the audience laughed. But Clint's response silenced the entire studio and became Colbert's most embarrassing moment on television. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was having one of its biggest nights of 2024. The guest list was impressive, but the crown jewel was Clint Eastwood, making a rare television appearance to promote what many believed would be his final film. At 94 years old, the legendary director and actor had become increasingly selective about his public appearances, making this interview a genuine television event. Stephen Colbert had been hosting The Late Show for nearly a decade, building his reputation on sharp political commentary and fearless interviews with controversial figures. His writers had spent days crafting material for the Eastwood segment, knowing that the cultural divide between the liberal comedian and the conservative icon could create television gold. What they didn't anticipate was how far Colbert would push the boundaries of respect. The studio audience was electric with anticipation as Colbert delivered his opening monologue, making several references to aging cowboys and old Hollywood dinosaurs. The jokes landed well with his typical demographic, setting the tone for what was clearly intended to be a roasting session rather than a respectful interview. Behind the scenes, producers were already sensing that the host was in one of his more aggressive moods. Clint arrived at the CBS studios in his characteristic, understated style. He wore a simple dark suit, moved slowly but with dignity, and spoke only when necessary to the production staff. Makeup artists noted his quiet demeanor and professional courtesy, but also observed the steely resolve in his eyes that had made him famous. At 94, he might have moved more slowly, but his mental sharpness remained undiminished. The tension was palpable as Clint took his seat across from Colbert. The host's usual pre-interview banter was met with polite but brief responses. Where most guests would engage in the typical late-night show energy, Clint remained composed and measured. This restraint seemed to frustrate Colbert, who thrived on the rapid-fire exchange that characterized his show. As the cameras rolled and the audience applauded, Colbert launched into his introduction with more edge than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen, he's directed more westerns than there are actual cowboys left in America. Please welcome the man who made talking to empty chairs famous, Clint Eastwood." The audience laughed at the reference to Clint's 2012 Republican National Convention speech, but there was an uncomfortable undertone to the introduction. Clint nodded, acknowledging the applause, but his expression remained neutral. He had faced hostile interviews before, weathered decades of Hollywood politics, and survived countless attempts to diminish his legacy. What Stephen Colbert was about to attempt was nothing new, but the response he would receive would be unlike anything in late-night television history. "So, Clint," Colbert began with his trademark smirk, "at 94, you're still making movies. Most people your age are, well, let's just say they're not operating heavy machinery anymore." The audience chuckled, but the joke's mean-spirited edge was unmistakable. Clint simply looked at him steadily, waiting for an actual question. Colbert continued, emboldened by the audience's response. "I have to ask, do you still do your own stunts? Because I imagine at this point, getting out of bed is pretty much a stunt in itself." More laughter erupted from the crowd, but several audience members shifted uncomfortably. The host was clearly targeting Eastwood's age in a way that felt more like bullying than comedy. "I do what the role requires," Clint replied calmly, his voice carrying the same measured tone that had commanded film sets for 6 decades. His refusal to take the bait seemed to irritate Colbert, who was accustomed to guests either playing along with his jokes or pushing back with equal energy. "Oh, come on," Colbert pressed, leaning forward with theatrical enthusiasm. "You've got to admit the action hero days are behind you. I mean, when was the last time you could actually make someone's day?" The reference to Clint's famous Dirty Harry line drew laughs, but the mocking tone was becoming increasingly obvious. Clint's expression didn't change, but Those who knew him well would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes. "I've been making people's days for 70 years, he said quietly. "Some of them just don't realize it yet." The response should have been a warning, but Colbert was too caught up in his performance to notice. His writers had prepared material designed to get under Eastwood's skin, and the host was determined to use every bit of it. The audience was laughing, the energy was high, and Colbert felt like he was in complete control of the interview. "Speaking of making people's days," Colbert continued, "I heard you still carry a gun. Is that for protection, or do you just forget it's there?" The joke was a reference to Eastwood's famous firearm advocacy, but delivered with a condescension that suggested the host viewed the elderly actor as potentially confused or dangerous. "I carry what I need to carry," Clint replied, his voice remaining level despite the increasingly personal nature of the attacks. "The question is, do you carry anything worth protecting?" The counter-question hung in the air for a moment, its implications slowly sinking in. But Colbert, riding high on audience laughter and his own momentum, missed the opportunity to recognize that he was dealing with someone far more formidable than his usual guests. What happened next would become the most replayed moment in late-night television history. Colbert, perhaps sensing that his previous jabs hadn't landed the way he'd hoped, decided to escalate his attack. He stood up from behind his desk, something he rarely did during interviews, and walked around to face Clint directly. "You know what, folks?" Colbert addressed the audience with theatrical flair. "I think we need to see if the legend still has it. Clint, how about you show us that famous squint, the one that made bad guys tremble and women swoon?" The audience laughed and applauded, expecting a playful demonstration. But Colbert wasn't finished. "Come on, cowboy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension as he spread his arms wide in a mocking gesture. "Show us that famous squint. Let's see if you can still look tough at 94 inches. The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers, completely caught up in what they thought was harmless entertainment. Clint remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the armrests of his chair. For a moment that felt like an eternity, he simply looked at Colbert with the steady gaze that had intimidated far more imposing men than this late-night comedian. The studio fell silent as everyone waited for his response. "You want to see tough?" Clint asked quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the studio despite barely being above a whisper. "Tough isn't performing for applause. Tough isn't picking on someone you think can't fight back." He paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the line that would destroy Colbert's moment of triumph. "Tough is building something that lasts longer than a punchline." The silence that followed was deafening. The audience, who had been laughing moments before, suddenly realized they had witnessed something far more significant than a comedy bit. Colbert, still standing in the middle of the stage, looked like a man who had just been hit by a truck he never saw coming. The camera captured every detail, Colbert's forced smile faltering, his hands dropping to his sides, the sudden realization in his eyes that he had badly miscalculated. In the audience, phones began emerging as people sensed they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Clint stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified. He didn't look angry, didn't appear flustered or defensive. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had built a legendary career on substance rather than spectacle, and who had just reminded everyone in that studio what the difference looked like. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. Colbert, realizing he needed to regain control of his own show, attempted to laugh off the moment. "Well, that's certainly one way to look at it," he said, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow in the quiet studio. But Clint wasn't finished. He took a step closer to Colbert, not in a threatening way, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to command attention. When he spoke again, his words cut through the artificial atmosphere of late-night television like a blade through silk. "Son," he said, looking directly into Colbert's eyes, "I've been making movies since before you were born. I've directed films that will be watched long after your show is canceled. I've built a career on respect, not ridicule." The word "son" was delivered without condescension, but with a weight of lived experience that made the age difference between them feel infinite. Colbert, who moments before had been confidently mocking Eastwood's age, suddenly looked like exactly what he was, a middle-aged comedian who had mistaken cynicism for wisdom. "And you want to know what tough really looks like?" Clint continued, his voice remaining calm but carrying an authority that filled the entire studio. "Tough is working for 70 years without tearing others down to build yourself up. Tough is earning respect instead of demanding it. Tough is knowing when to speak and when to listen." He paused, glancing around the studio at the cameras, the crew, the audience that had been laughing at his expense just moments before. "But most of all, tough is understanding that your legacy isn't measured by how many people you can make laugh at someone else's expense." The final blow came with devastating simplicity. Clint looked back at Colbert, who was now standing frozen in the middle of his own stage, and delivered the line that would end the segment, dominate social media, and become one of the most quoted comebacks in television history. "It's measured by how many people remember you with respect when the cameras stop rolling." The studio erupted, but not with laughter. This time it was applause, genuine and sustained, as the audience recognized they had witnessed something extraordinary. But it wasn't the kind of applause that Colbert was used to receiving. This was for Clint Eastwood, and the host knew it. Colbert attempted to respond, opening his mouth as if to deliver a comeback, but no words came. How do you follow up being completely dismantled by someone who never raised their voice, never resorted to insults, and never lost their dignity? What followed was perhaps more humiliating for Colbert than the verbal dismantling itself. The host attempted to salvage the interview by shifting to prepared questions about Eastwood's upcoming film, but the dynamic in the studio had fundamentally changed. Every joke fell flat. Every attempt at cleverness seemed forced and desperate compared to the quiet authority Clint had just demonstrated. The audience, who had been laughing with Colbert at the beginning of the segment, now sat in respectful attention as Clint spoke about his work, his philosophy, and his approach to filmmaking. The contrast was stark. Where Colbert's humor had felt mean-spirited and performative, Eastwood's responses were thoughtful, genuine, and commanding. As the interview concluded, Clint stood and shook Colbert's hand with the same professional courtesy he had shown throughout the evening. But the damage was done. The host's closing monologue felt anticlimactic, and even his most loyal audience members were already pulling out their phones to share what they had just witnessed. Within minutes of the show's conclusion, clips of the exchange were spreading across social media platforms. The hashtag #Clint destroyed Colbert began trending on Twitter within the hour. TikTok users were already creating reaction videos, with most expressing shock at how completely the 94-year-old icon had outclassed the experienced television host. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Conservative commentators hailed it as a perfect example of old-school class defeating modern rudeness. Liberal viewers, many of whom typically supported Colbert, found themselves admitting that the host had crossed a line and gotten what he deserved. The rare bipartisan agreement was that Clint Eastwood had delivered one of the most devastating verbal takedowns in television history without ever losing his cool. YouTube compilations appeared overnight, comparing Colbert's mocking tone with Eastwood's dignified responses. The contrast was even more striking when viewed back-to-back, highlighting how the comedian's aggressive humor paled in comparison to the actor's quiet wisdom. Late-night television critics, who typically defended hosts against charges of going too far, found themselves in the unusual position of acknowledging that Colbert had been thoroughly outclassed. Entertainment Weekly called it a masterclass in how to lose an argument you started, while Variety described it as the night Stephen Colbert learned that some legends are legendary for a reason. By morning, the clip had been viewed over 10 million times across all platforms. Colbert's team attempted damage control by claiming the exchange had been good television, but the narrative had already been established. The host had tried to humiliate a 94-year-old legend and had been quietly, thoroughly, and publicly schooled in return. The long-term consequences of that night extended far beyond social media buzz and viral clips. Within a week, Colbert's ratings showed their first significant decline in years, as viewers who had lost respect for his treatment of Eastwood began tuning out. The host attempted to address the controversy in subsequent monologues, but his explanations came across as defensive rather than apologetic. More significantly, the incident sparked a broader conversation about the culture of late-night television and the treatment of elderly guests. Media critics began questioning whether the pursuit of viral moments had led hosts to abandon basic courtesy and respect. The Eastwood interview became a case study in how not to handle an interview with a respected figure. For Clint Eastwood, the aftermath was entirely different. His upcoming film saw a surge in pre-release interest, with many citing their newfound respect for the director as motivation for supporting his work. Interview requests poured in from media outlets eager to feature the man who had reminded America what dignity looked like in the face of disrespect. Perhaps most tellingly, several other elderly celebrities publicly thanked Eastwood for his response, with many sharing their own experiences of being diminished or mocked because of their age. The incident became a rallying point for discussions about ageism in entertainment and the media's responsibility to treat all guests with respect, regardless of their political views or age. Colbert eventually offered a qualified apology several weeks later, acknowledging that his approach had been too aggressive, but stopping short of taking full responsibility for the incident. The half-hearted nature of the apology only reinforced the public's perception that he had learned little from the experience. The most lasting impact, however, was the reminder that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. Clint Eastwood had faced down hostile interviews, political attacks, and decades of Hollywood politics, but his response to Colbert demonstrated why his legacy had endured. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to insult, didn't need to descend to his attacker's level. Instead, he had done what he had always done, stood his ground with quiet dignity, and let his character speak for itself. In an age of social media outrage and performative conflict, his response reminded viewers what authentic strength looked like. The interview became required viewing in journalism schools as an example of how interviews can go wrong, and in film schools as a demonstration of why Clint Eastwood remained a legend even in his 90s. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't the loudest one. Sometimes it's the one that reminds everyone in the room who they're really dealing with. Have you ever witnessed someone respond to disrespect with such dignity that it completely changed the dynamic? Share your story in the comments below.
Don't forget to hit the like button if you liked the video and subscribe if you want videos like this to come. See you in the next story.